Hello to everyone at Rainbow Space Magic. I hope you all can hear me. This is a really exciting way to start off the conference. This is Rainbow Space Magic Conference 6, and you're at the When Queerness is Not a Plot Point panel. So before our panelists introduce themselves, I'm just going to go over a few logistics. First of all, by the way, I'm Tucker Lieberman. Hello. And you are welcome to use the chat to talk to each other and share recommendations in a respectful manner. If you'd like to submit a question for the panelists, use the Q&A function or put a little question mark before your question to make it clear to the tech person and panelists that you're asking a question. If it's also phrased as a question, that would be helpful too. And there will be time for questions closer to the end of the panel, but feel free to write them as you think of them. And after the panel, the conversation can continue because we're on Discord, so use the channel for this panel when queerness is not a plot point. Without further ado, let's get to the panel. I will turn it over to Molly Topple, who is the moderator.
Hello, everybody. My name is Molly Topple, and I am a professional developmental editor of fiction, generally sci-fi and horror, and I'm moderating today. And so you're not here to listen to me is one of the things that means. So I'm going to turn things over real briefly to each of our panelists so that they can introduce themselves. I'll start with E.
Hi there, I'm E.M. Anderson, or just E is good. My pronouns are she, they. I am a queer and neurodivergent author and the author of The Keeper of Lonely Spirits, which is out now, The Lord of the Wood, which is upcoming, and The Remarkable Retirement of Edna Fisher, which is sadly out of print for the time being. And in addition to writing, I love birding, playing the recorder, doing various forms of visual art, and pole dance, which actually will be going from here to a performance. So I have a busy day today.
Great to hear. Great to hear. Okay, Serena.
Hi, everyone. This is my first Rainbow Space Magic. I'm very excited. I'm an author, and on the side, I've been an occasional scientist and/or science teacher. But right now, that's kind of hard in my area of Maryland, in the Washington, D.C. area. My seventh novel comes out in the fall. Most of them fall in the spec fic arena. I like science fiction that leans into biomedical areas of science and also paranormal and the nice little Venn diagram where they may blend together. I'm also the secretary of the Sapphic Literary Collective, aka the Sapphic Lit Pop-Up Bookstore. And I'm married and I have a little fur baby sleeping beside me, and I live in Maryland.
Wonderful. All right, Keila.
Hi there, this is also my first Rainbow Magic. I go by they, he, she, and I'm a freelance editor, translator, and sometimes I'm a writer. I was born in Peru, but now I live in Canada, and I work with prose, poetry, comics, and scripts, and I work with most genres, but my favorite ones are sci-fi, horror, and fantasy.
Thank you, Keila. And finally, Michael.
I'm Michael G. Williams. I write queer horror and science fiction, especially cosmic horror and supernatural horror. A lot of it's set in the southeastern United States. I am a native of Appalachia, and lately have just been really driven by trying to set cosmic horror stories in Appalachia. I also co-host a podcast about regional folklore called Our King Carolinas and have written some nonfiction collections of regional folklore.
Great, wonderful. Excited to hear what you all have to say for this panel, which I'm going to introduce it with a quote from a Tumblr post that I can't find anymore. So this is just me reconstructing things out of thin air potentially. But the quote goes, "The question is not why people are trans. As a group, trans people explore every possible reaction to the systems of gender and embodiment that they are presented with. What explanation could you ever give to why human possibility exists? Ask instead why people are cis. That actually has an answer." And that quote appeals to me a lot for reasons that are very much related to my own identity. But I think that it also speaks to queerness more generally, even though it is speaking specifically to the trans experience, queerness more generally has this potential to reinstate the fundamental possibility of human relationality and understandings of the world that we live in. And so it's is plot relevant sometimes, but it goes beyond that so much. And so I would like to open things up with the question of what are we talking about on this panel? What is it exactly that counts as when queerness is not a plot point? And where is the line between queerness being or not being part of the plot? I think I'd like to start with Serena.
Excellent. The hardest question. So I saw the prepare to give your 2-minute answer, and I have wrote down my thoughts, and I I have a singular question back to that question.
Uh-huh.
Because I thought about it. Well, for me, it was deep thought. For others, maybe that's pretty superficial. But I came down to the point whether the plot or, the storyline in general, if that could happen in the same exact way, um, if there were cis heteronormative people playing those characters. And if the answer is yes, that story can happen the exact same way, then I don't think queerness has an element to the plot. However, if character dynamics change, if tension change, if plot changes, then queerness, made a stamp and had the substantial element of it.
Mhm. Yeah, and I absolutely follow what you mean about the like whether the aspect of queerness changes what people do. I think that's a really profound kind of question and something to meditate on. And Michael, I think that in our preparations for this panel, that was something that you were specifically meditating on. So I'd like to turn this to you next.
Yes, and what I'm about to say is in no way meant to be a contradiction or criticism. um, for me, the question is the inciting incident of the story related to queerness? Everything after that, queerness can be a part of it. But if the story is specifically a coming out story, then queerness is a plot point. If the story is specifically about, if it begins specifically, another example might be somebody being rejected by their loved ones for their queerness. And so the story sort of takes that classic structure of everything was fine until they get rejected for it or they experience some other trauma as a result of it. And that is what steers the story off into happening in the first place. If it's not about those, if queerness is not the inciting incident for the story, then I think that queerness kind of necessarily has to play a part in the rest of the story, regardless of whether we think of it as a plot point, in part because I don't think it's actually possible for me as a queer person to have the exact same events and reactions to those events happen as would happen to a non-queer person. Just because I think that as a queer person, I relate to the world in so many different ways. So many ways in which I relate to the world are different from how I think of, for instance, non-queer friends of mine related to the world. And all the times that we have experienced the same thing and had different reactions from one another. And that reaction ultimately boiled down to how I viewed the world differently and how I related to the world differently as a queer person. So that's not to say that I think that Serena is wrong or anything. It's just, for me, that question really boils down to, does the story start because of their queerness? Because I feel like regardless, the story kind of has to end differently because of their queerness.
You can see that too. The aspect of like the plot point maybe being even a little bit narrow, the queerness as a plot structure it seems to be what I'm picking up of what you're speaking to. Keila, curious what you have to say about this.
I think my answer is a mix of what Serena and Michael have mentioned because I do love Serena's example of like if I can put straight people on this scenario and this story carries on as normal, then it's not a plot point. But I do also understand that queerness has to be like a story with queerness as a plot point has to be like a coming out story or something like that. So in my case, to me, the line is defined if the story itself is about the characters discovering, accepting, or expressing their queer identity or relationship. Because I've read books of people already okay with their queerness, but it's their first time in a queer relationship. So because it is about a queer relationship specifically, it is a plot point. So I would say, at least in my opinion, it's a mix of both things.
So I'm getting a sense of like a spectrum of answers here. The line is not necessarily a line, but something maybe a little bit more fuzzy. I wonder if you might help us to narrow things down a bit.
Oh, well, considering that my thoughts that I wrote down started out saying the line is extremely wibbly wobbly to me, I don't think I'm gonna offer any clarity. So yeah, what Michael said resonated with me because thinking as like a neurodivergent person, I can write stories where like autism or ADHD is not a plot point, but you're not like it's not going to be a one-to-one like a neurotypical person would react in all the same ways because they just wouldn't. And I know that's slightly different because it's like something like specifically in my brain as opposed to something a little more socially mediated. But I do think that's similar to queerness. And with autism especially, like you can see a lot of the talk in the community is very similar to the way the queer community talks about itself, and even things like you have to like come out to people as autistic, which is so annoying because I hate coming out regardless of what I'm coming out as. I'm just like, nope, I'm just gonna stick this in my author bio and my social media bios, and if you don't know that I'm queer and neurodivergent, that's a you problem, but I don't care. So like they are similar. So I think that like to that extent, like that makes it very hard to say like could this story happen exactly the same way with straight people, because like could probably happen similarly, like if you have a fantasy story, so it's not like a coming out story or whatever, and it's just like a straightforward like we're gonna overthrow Sauron, I'm just gonna be specific about it, like you can have queer characters doing that and that can all kind of happen the same way, but at the same time it's not going to be completely the same because the way they exist in the world is different. But I do kind of think of queerness as a plot point more if people are having to deal with what I consider like queer issues, so like issues of coming out or of self-discovery, or of dealing with like queer phobia and things like that, that straight people would not have to deal with or are less likely. I mean, you could have a straight person that people think is gay and so they get like homophobia even though they're not actually gay, but generally speaking, like kind of queer issues I would consider more of a plot point. And then if you have a story like a queer normative world where those issues just don't exist, and the characters are having an unrelated plot, and they're existing as queer people doing this unrelated thing where they're not really having to like deal with the queerness, but it's still there and it's still part of them, I would consider like queerness not being a plot point. And then when you get to romance, I do think it's a little stickier because it's like, so is a romance novel. I know this is a speculative fiction panel, but like, just let me go for a second. If it's a romance, let's say a romantasy, because that puts us back in fantasy. So if you have a romantasy novel and the romance aspect is queer, and the romance is like kind of the main plot of the fantasy because it's a romantasy, like is that an inherently queer plot because a queer relationship may look different than a straight relationship, or is it not a queer plot unless they are dealing with those queer issues? And that's where I was like, I don't know, that's a question for the audience and I'm not going to come up with an answer right now. So yeah, so my answer is that I don't have an answer and it's very wibbly wobbly and it depends on who you ask and what your considerations are.
All right. Sounds fun. Also, wading into whether or not Lord of the Rings has queer characters, I think maybe is a bit beyond the scope of this panel. But on a similar subject, I want to know what like in those cases where it kind of is a little bit clearer, what are some good examples of plot irrelevant queer representation, and why do you think they work? I think I will start this with Kayla.
Okay, so in this case, I have really two good examples that come to mind. One of them is a book, is The Stars So Fondly by Emily Hamilton, and the other one is Signalis by Rose Engine, and they both have sapphic characters, but I'll just start with the book real quick. So the book itself has a really diverse cast. It has a lot of people of color, it has a trans woman, it has sapphics, it has a non-binary person. So it's really diverse, but their stories really doesn't touch on their queerness. These university kids get into a broken spaceship and they throw it into space. So their whole story is trying to get back to Earth. And yeah, the book itself is about a connection and family too, but they never get into a plot of like discovering themselves um, or their sexuality, to be honest. The story is pretty much separated from it, but still works. And in the case of the game, the creators of the game mentioned on social media that is really no homophobia in that universe. It's like a universe of like androids and humans, and some humans are with androids, but there's a homophobia. But the characters still fight against systemic oppression and colonialism. So the representation on both I really like, because love is a really present theme on both stories, but in this case the player and the readers get to focus on different aspects of the world and the life of the characters.
Yeah, and oh man, I do love me some Signalis.
Right?
And yeah, that game is so much a game. I love it. And I'm very glad that it's now part of the panel. So I think I'll turn things over to E next.
Okay, so I actually had a lot of trouble with this question after considering my answer to the first question. But first I'm gonna go with just the first Murderbot book because that's the only one I've read and can speak to. All Systems Red. So because it's a very queer norm world, like there's like polyamory going on and there's queer relationships going on, and like it's not a big deal because that's just how the world works, and that's not what the story is about. So I think that, and you get like different pictures of queer relationships and things. So I always think that is good for representation because you're not just getting kind of like this is just like one picture of queerness and this is just what queerness looks like. It's more diverse than that. And then also Bitter Medicine by Mia Tsai, which has a relationship between a half elf and a human, and the half elf is a bisexual man. And so and that's not, I mean, they develop a relationship through the course of the story, but the story is not really about that as much. It's about some other things that they're dealing with. And there's like kind of spying going on and subterfuge and all sorts of cool stuff. It's a really neat, it's kind of like if you enjoyed Artemis Fowl as a kid, but you would like that for adults, like a little bit, it reminds me of that, in terms of like the way the world is and how the like kind of supernatural creatures sort of are in that world. But I digress. So anyway, so yeah, so he's bisexual, and I thought it was really good because sometimes I think with bisexual characters in particular, or pansexual characters too, basically any kind of sexuality where you're attracted to more than one gender, I think often you end up in this trap of like, especially if there's like a male female relationship where like you're just like, oh yes, they're bi, and then you never like see in their head of them like finding someone of the same gender attractive, or like don't really get much about any previous relationships or anything, or if you do, it feels like it's very shoehorned in to be like, oh, by the way, they're bisexual. And in this book, the character like remembers a past relationship that he had with a man, and it feels like just a very realistic way of how you think about someone that you are exes with, and it just felt very natural. It just felt like it arose from the character and the world, and not like it was like, oh, by the way, just so you know, even though he's with a woman right now, he is bi. Like it just felt more natural than that. So I felt like it was a much better representation than when you fall into that trap of like really trying to get it in there. So yes, and also just like a really fun kind of adult. Again, I don't want to comp it to Artemis Fowl too hard because overall it's not like that, but I think just in terms of the way magical creatures move through the world. So that one was called Bitter Medicine.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much. And Serena.
All right. This is another one I really thought hard about this. And to give you a little bit of context, like this might be a product of my interests or my age or where I was from, but when people, say, "What's one word to describe you?" I usually say nerd. I don't say lesbian. It's not that being a lesbian isn't important to me. It's just not that part of my identity that I feel is that defines me. And that's kind of where I went when I thought about this question, because the reason it was so hard for me to think about was because when I encounter a really well-drawn character, very realistic, even if it's in a fantastic world, but they're just so well-rounded that queer isn't necessarily the first word as I remember them. I remember them by how they stood up to plot. So for that, and you'll have to forgive me because I do read, for pleasure, I read a lot of sapphic romance where queerness is very much like an element there. So I tended to default to my favorite sci-fi here. So I thought of Kazima from Orphan Black. Because when I think of that character, I think of, being a scientist, struggle and battle with illness, and the diversity she had with her clones, not necessarily that she was in love with Delphine. I also wrote down the Black Mirror episode San Juniperno, which I think is a wonderfully beautiful love story, but the love story is the subplot. It is about, technology that takes you back in time to experience things. And then I wrote down the character Giles, played by Richard Jenkins in The Shape of Water. Because yeah, he identified as queer in that movie, but I remember him as being the friend, as being someone she ate pie with. Just because all these characters are just so well-rounded. I love them. And it's just, yeah, their identity or their relationship wasn't the first thing that came to mind.
Great, great. Thank you. And let's round this question out with Michael.
So the very first characters that came to mind for me were Lieutenant Stamets and Dr. Culber in Star Trek Discovery, and Adira and Gray in Star Trek Discovery, two great examples of queer couples and a queer family, a queer found family storyline where they are in a setting where queerness is totally unremarkable. None of them ever describes having experienced transphobia or homophobia or queerphobia of any sort. And their relationships are complex. They disagree with each other. They face challenges together. They experience traumas together that don't have anything to do with their queerness. But the queerness of those characters, it is so casually on display and so casually validated in a way that makes queer viewers, in my experience, like I personally watching it felt so validated as just like a hardcore gay Star Trek nerd. It was just like, yes, this is like literally what I have waited 40 years for Star Trek to do. So I was just so thrilled. There are plenty of Star Trek episodes in which queerness is a plot point, and it's a really hard plot point that people cannot get past. And these are examples of storylines about characters whose queerness is never in question. It is never in doubt. It's never hidden. It's never like a maybe they are, but the stories that they're experiencing are not driven by that queerness. They navigate the stories using their queerness, but the stories don't happen to them because of that. Another great example that comes to mind is Natanya Barron's book, Netherford Hall. Natanya happens to be a friend of mine, but she is like blowing up majorly. She also wrote this really amazing Arthurian series called Queen of Mercy. But Netherford Hall is this sort of Regency era romantasy where the central romance is sapphic romance, but it's a world in which basically every character is gay, lesbian, or pansexual. And they even mention at one point that there are people in society who think that that is weird and wrong, but they're so uncommon to encounter that everybody just thinks that is just like that phobia about that is just the strangest, weirdest throwback idea. And so this is a really queer, affirming setting with just boatloads of queer characters. And never is that story driven by their queerness, but queerness is celebrated throughout it. So I don't know. Those are the first ones that leapt to mind.
Wonderful. I am hoping that we can, after the panel is over, that we can toss all of these recommendations into the Discord channel and get some discussion going there as well. So the next question is on queer normative worlds and the ways that they change storytelling. So how do they change storytelling? What kinds of stories do you find that they make possible? I'm going to send this right back to Michael.
So I think queer normative worlds achieve a lot of really important and admirable goals, specifically for queer readers of those worlds and viewers of those worlds. They validate the identity of the queer reader or the queer viewer, even though the reader or viewer lives in a world that does not validate our identity. That's a really powerful experience to be told by what we are consuming, by the media that we are consuming, the stories that we love, that we're okay. And when we live in a world that tells us constantly that we're not okay, that's a really powerful experience. They also cultivate in queer readers and queer viewers the idea that a world in which that is not controversial is possible. And that's a really powerful idea to plant in our minds in order to help us build a world where that becomes true. I feel like queer normative worlds really do fertilize the soil of activism and change in an important way. But I also think they do something really subtle. maybe people who are cishet think this is not subtle. I don't know. But I think that queer normative worlds, by telling stories about queer characters where queerness is not the plot point, they create an opportunity for cishet people to be prompted to think about their attitudes toward queerness without it feeling what I think cishet people often feel is preachy. And I don't agree with that. I think that queer people talking out loud about our experience is not preachy and does not need to be criticized by cishet people. But there are plenty of cishet people who consider that a real hard stop, and they just can't get over that. And I think a queer normative world gives us ways to talk to those cishet people about the queer experience and sort of sneak those ideas into their brains in a way that is less insidious than that sounds. And a great example I can think of that is Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness. You know, it's obviously a very political book. It's a very political book about gender, written kind of at the height of second wave feminism. There's a lot of ways in which it is a hardcore, like right on the nose political book. But it is also a very queer book in a way that I think a lot of people who are not queer don't stop and think about, but they sure do wind up thinking about it as a result of having read it.
Right. So I'm definitely getting a sense from your answer that one of the main ways that queer normative worlds change storytelling is that they change the larger world in which the stories are told. Serena, I think I'd like to turn this to you.
All right. Yeah, that was a fantastic response, and yeah, the references to Gwen's book especially. Um, when I first read the question, I almost I looked at it like, how would a queer normative world change myself? You know, because I do like to plant a lot of realism into what I write, into what I read, and like I had mentioned, even though, I live in a fairly progressive area, my family at least, is progressive. Can't talk about the wife's that way. But mine is at least. And I was just thinking, in a queer normative world, there wouldn't be coding. I wouldn't have to see a stranger and go back to talking about my spouse. I could talk about my wife. I wouldn't have to have that modicum of fear when someone goes, "Oh, are you sisters?" It's like, no, not sisters. We're married. Um, we don't hold hands in public. One, like, she just thinks my hands are hot, but also, the uncomfortable aspects to it. And, that reality changes the way I look at story. And if there wasn't a world where we had to code, and God forbid we just are accepted for how we present, you know, it would be beautiful. And I love it when story is normative, so that people who don't even who especially identify as queer can see themselves, um and I hate to say that again, normative, because normative comes from normal. Um, but I also think it's very important for those who don't identify as queer to read that and see the subtle differences, because then they finally realize, oh, this isn't the world in which I live. This must make people who identify as something other than myself uncomfortable. Maybe I should do something to change that.
Mhm.
So those are my thoughts.
Continuing the activist through line, love it. E, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I feel like my thoughts are less profound because I was just like, they make all stories outside of issues books possible. Like, you can just go on a fantasy adventure that is not about queerness, but you can go on that adventure as a queer person and you're not in danger from your queerness. You're probably in danger of like getting eaten by a dragon or something, but like the queerness is not the problem. Nobody's gonna like do anything to you because of that. It's just a hungry dragon and there's no helping that. But I did actually think when Serena was describing her answer about, so like not only would the coding be unnecessary, but people would maybe not even make those assumptions. Like, people wouldn't say, "Are you sisters?" They might actually just assume you're married instead, the way a man and a woman walking around together are generally assumed to be dating or married. So like you wouldn't even have to, like again, I hate coming out. I'm not closeted. I just hate coming out. So if I've actually personally come out to someone, there's probably a specific reason that I did come out to them, but otherwise I'm like, no, you can read my bios. And I post a little stupid pride flag meme that I made every Pride Month and whatever. And so I just love that. I love queer normative worlds. Honestly, there are so many bigger issues as a queer person, and yet what I most love about queer norm worlds is that nobody ever has to come out to anybody. So my next book is actually not queer norm, which is really weird for me. But usually I write queer norm stories, and the only thing kind of vaguely like a coming out that I ever write is more like when a younger character is talking to an older queer character, and they're not even really coming out, they're just like trying to figure themselves out, and they would like some help with that. Like in my book, The Keeper of Lonely Spirits, there's this like 13-year-old kid, and this boy walks into the library and he turns to the main character and he's like, how do you know if you like boys? Because he's just trying to figure out, he thinks he might be bisexual but he doesn't really know, and he just wants some advice. And that's the closest you get, because I think that would probably still happen even in a queer norm world. Like, because because there are queer people who know those things like from childhood, and then there are people like me who very much did not know those things from childhood. And so like, you might be a late bloomer, or you just like don't think of it immediately. It might happen sooner if it's a queer norm world, because you're not like, that those are options. You're not like so surrounded by just, cis heteronormativity that you think that's the only way to live your life. But there would be no coming out, and that's my big, again, there's so many more important issues actually facing queer people, but that's my big thing, that I'm like, I just hate coming out and I should never have to, and people should just magically know I'm queer and it shouldn't be a big deal.
Love it. Love it. Kayla, let's hear what you have to say. That was so
I agree
impressive. Kayla, I
with
would love to hear what you have to say.
It's okay. I agree with E in terms of coming out because the stories about self-discovery and coming out are good, but the queer experience really goes beyond that. So when a story like already has a queer normative world, the characters are able to go beyond that initial discovery of like, what do I like, or their identity. So the story doesn't end with self-discovery in queer normative worlds. It basically begins with it, and I think that gives a space to interesting storytelling. It makes the stories about queer people and the full scope of their lives instead of just the queer side of their lives, like Serena mentioned, but other side of their lives, their career, their hobbies, things like that.
Mhm. Great. Yeah. Thank you very much. And I think our last question, which after this we'll have some time for Q&A, for audience Q&A. So please do be submitting your questions to the Q&A feature, or throw them into chat with the preceding question mark so that I know to flag it. But the last question for the panelists, from me, is what narrative tools and tropes, including found family, help you to feel at home in a story that isn't overtly queer? I'll start with E for this.
Okay, so found family is a big one, and also just any ride or die friendship. But also just more generally, stories that involve subverting some certain cultural norms. So this is not a queer book to my knowledge. There could be queerness in it. I think it showed up like right as the panel started. I haven't checked my mail yet. I saw it in a list from Fat Girls in Fiction on Instagram. It's called Soft Flannel Hank, which instantly I was like, all right, I want to see what this book's about. So it's like a romance novel, but it actually starts with the male main character like in therapy for the first time, like trying that out, and he's in therapy and his therapist is just like, "How are you?" And he starts listing his reasons for being in therapy, and she's like, "That's not what I asked," and he was like, "Well, I just want you to fix me," and she was like, "That's not how this works." And so that was just in the sample pages, and I just instantly loved that. Like he's this big burly guy, and he's divorced, and he just like doesn't feel good about himself, and he's going to therapy, and I love that. I love books that tell people that like that is a good thing to do, and and it's okay for you to have those feelings, but also it's okay for you to like work through those feelings, be it with a friend or a therapist or whatever. So I just really love that. I love books that subvert cultural norms, like, oh, if you need therapy, something must be really wrong with you, or like it's weak to ask for help or whatever you have. And I especially love it, like I said, in this case, because of the nature of the character, where he is like this big burly straight guy. And I love that. I love, like, instantly I was like, okay, we're just gonna buy this and read it, because already it has my heart just from like the first 5 pages sending this guy to therapy. I loved that.
Mhm. It is great to see that kind of thing. Kayla.
In For narrative tools, I have to say backstories. I just love when let's say a character is just doing something important, and people ask about their backstory. It's like, okay, yeah, I did that. This terrible thing happened to me, but this is not important right now. We have to, I have to keep going on with my goal. And when it comes to tropes, I want to say also shapeshifters and hybrids. These are just really specific tropes I love, and even if they're not in a queer story, they're a little bit queer to me. So I just always enjoy to see them in media.
I mean, I do also personally just love the idea of a body that responds to will. That sounds great. Okay,
Exactly, yeah.
and Michael.
For me, it's almost always like secret magic powers. Like a magic user who has to keep that hidden for some reason. For me, that's always a really powerful metaphor for queerness. I always, when I see that, it automatically becomes a queer story. Another is somebody who is supposed to have access to magic, but for whatever reason it hasn't developed. They haven't been trained, whatever the deal is. And so this story is about them accessing that magic for the first time. Always a very queer story. But as a horror writer, my favorite, not a queer trope, but it's a queer trope, is the final girl or the final them. as I usually prefer to say it, because it's just like way more inclusive. But Final Girls, and if you think of like Ripley from the Alien series, or you think of Sydney from the Scream series, or Laurie Strode, especially in light of the 2018 Halloween reboot, those are people who live in a world where they have experienced direct hostility and threat. And that isn't because of who they are. Like who they are, that didn't turn them into who they were at the beginning of it. They were not who they were at the beginning of their story because of that threat, but that threat manifested in their life. And they have had, by the end of their story, a unique experience of surviving that. And then, they kind of have to just like get up and go to work tomorrow, regardless of all the awful things that just happened to them. You look at Laurie Strode in Halloween 2018, and she's just like tried to go live her life after the events of the first Halloween movie. And the fact that it's been a disaster is not really her fault. And repeatedly in the Scream series, Sydney just like tries to go have a life. In Aliens, what's the first thing that Ripley does? She has to get a job and go back to work to pay for the apartment that the company has assigned to her, because she's still under contract despite having just survived, from her perspective, the events of Alien. And so there's this way in which that is, for me, always a very queer story of the people around that character don't really understand what they've gone through, and they never really will. And they can say nice things to them and say that they're supportive and pat them on the back all day long, and it won't take away what they've experienced, and it won't help them achieve what only they can achieve either. And so I don't know, for me, that's a very powerful idea.
Great, thank you. And Serena, pride of place, beginning and ending the moderator questions.
Well, two came up, or rather reminded me. I had written down body swap, which in terms of shape shifting, I think just not being, entirely comfortable in your own skin and wanting to be this other, and transforming. And what Michael had just said reminded me, and I'd written down, there's so many horror themes that are good. And if you have not, I'm sure a lot of people have read It Came from the Closet. It's a fascinating collection of essays looking at various horror films and how they represent, or how you can look at different queer themes within those films. Really interesting. But aside from the body swapping and the horror themes, I think time travel, I think for me is a trope that resonates, because I think, also being someone who identifies as being a woman, what would it be like in the 15th, going back to the 15th century, where that isn't, or 15th century Europe at least, where that is not treated with equality, with respect, with autonomy, and it's within sometimes those tropes, those themes. I find queer elements without themselves being queer.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And we do have a question in chat from Tanner. So villains in stories are often queer coded in cis heteronormative worlds. How could queer villainy be done well, in your opinion? I think I'm going to turn that to Michael first.
I love queer coded villains. They are my favorite thing to see, because villains are powerful. Every villain is somebody who has been told, no, you are not allowed to, fill the earth with nougat, or whatever it is they're trying to achieve. And they have said, well, you know what? That's what I want. And I understand why that's important to me. And the world has told me that I'm not allowed to do this. And so I'm going to do it anyway, because I get to decide what I'm going to do. And so I love queer coded villains. Queer coded villains are massively powerful characters with a ton of agency. And I love it. So I think my answer is it's already been done really well a bunch of times, even though basically every time I've ever talked about that in a panel at a convention, it's been in the context of somebody saying, but queer coded villains are so bad. All they do is tell us that we're villains. And I'm like, no, they tell us that we can do what we want. And it doesn't matter how the good people tell us we can't.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, love it. Keila, I think I'll turn this to you next.
I'm also a great fan of queer-coded villains. Like, yeah, exactly. You do you. Go against the current. You got it, bestie. Basically, a queer-coded villain in a uh, in a queer normative world. I think it would still be fun to see because queer people, like, yeah, we're all queer, but we're not also not a monolith. We can disagree over simple stuff, I want to say. So it would still be fun to see like a queer hero go against a queer villain. You know, like that meme, like behind every gay person there's a more evil gay person. So yeah, I want to say that it would be a little bit tricky, but it can work. I see it happening. Yeah.
Serena?
Oh boy, the first thing that comes to mind is the throuple of Spike, Angel, and Drusilla in Buffy. And I just adore them to pieces because they are all such, again, good, well-rounded characters. Um, and because you just like them, they're fun. Um, yeah, I just love them. Yay, throuple.
Mm-hmm. All right. Oh yeah, and E?
I'm gonna be the boring one here because I'm not a villain girly, just like in general. All my friends are like villains, and I'm like, I usually like the good guys. I'm so sorry that I'm so boring. I actually feel like a very boring queer person in many ways, except I do pole fitness now, so I'm like, that's really cool. Whatever. I have one whole tattoo now. I'm like, oh my God, look at me. Anyway, yeah, so I don't know. The queer coding of the villains has never bothered me. Um, I don't know if that is because, like, subconsciously, even if I don't like what the villain's doing, I'm like, yeah, I like villains who have, like, a good, like, I don't like the evil just for the sake of evil. So when a villain who's evil just for the sake of evil is queer coded, it does kind of annoy me. Although at the same time, like, maybe they just like being evil. Maybe that's fun for them. I don't know. Maybe that's why so many people enjoy villains. Everybody's like, you know what? A little evil would be like, at least they're evil with flair. Like in real life, the evil people who are doing evil things in the world are doing it so boringly and hatefully. And I'm like, you could have built like an evil lair and had like a shrink ray and done all this cool stuff just for the sake of being evil. And instead you're being boring and hateful to like make more money or something. So I guess if your queer coded villain has like some flair, even if you're like, well, that's why they're queer coded, I don't care. That is kind of fun actually. But if you are like a baby writer and you're like, I don't want to do that or whatever, first of all, if you have a cast of queer characters, your villain could just be a straight guy because that's, in real life, often, not to like stereotype cishet men, but like often that's the villain in real life, white cishet men. Um, Alternatively, I mean, if your whole cast of characters is queer, it honestly doesn't matter if your villain is queer coded or explicitly queer because that's not the only picture of queer. I tend to think, in general, if you're writing diversity of any kind, if you have multiple characters who share a general identity, like if you have multiple neurodivergent characters, for example, then that way, like, that's just a better way to do it because then you don't just have one picture of it where you're going, that is what that looks like. Now you have, like, you can show, like, a fuller picture of what that kind of identity can look like. So yeah, so if you're looking like for like actual advice, that'd be my advice. But I don't have a good answer because everybody else was like villains, and I was like, I'm not a villain person.
Oh, we need a diversity of opinions on this panel. That's what the whole point of the panel is. Go, Michael, go ahead.
I thought of a good example, I think maybe that answers that person's question. The book, This Is How You Lose the Time War.
Oh.
Arguably, they are each the villain for the other's story. And I did the audiobook, and the audiobook features female readers for both Blue and Red. So it's a sapphic love story in addition. And it is just an incredibly powerful story of exposing the way that binaries are kind of garbage. I'm really trying to not cuss. I normally just like cuss like a sailor. I had to do a lot of inline editing in that statement, but the book itself is a great way to talk about binaries as kind of being garbage, and so wonderful also as an example of everybody is the villain in somebody's story.
I love that book.
It's a wonderful book. I think before we close, I kind of want to go through and open this up a little bit to intro panel questions. Do any of you have questions for anybody else to like extend your answers or from what you know of each other's expertise, anything like that? All right, seeing none, I think that we can call this a panel. So the last thing to do is to go through and have each of you tell the fine folk attending where you can be found and what you would like to plug. I'll start with E.
Yeah, so to keep up with my releases, regardless of what happens on social media, you can subscribe to my newsletter at buttondown.com/ElizMAnderson. You can also follow me on Blue Sky or Instagram at ElizMAnderson. My upcoming cozy horror, which is it's an accident that it was horror, but that's okay. The Lord of the Wood is about a 43-year-old autistic guy who has a gay and kind of low-key monster fucker awakening after getting lost in an enchanted forest. That releases in July, and you can add it on Goodreads or the Storygraph now. And then if you'd like to read my work in the meantime, you can find The Keeper of Lonely Spirits wherever books are sold, or download my short stories on Itch.io, where I am again Eliz M. Anderson. They're all name your price, but tips are appreciated because I do not make a lot of money.
Common story. Serena.
Thanks. Yeah, this was a great panel. I'm on social media, not TikTok. Don't look for me there. But yeah, please subscribe to my newsletter at serenajbishop.com. It's a real catchy name. All of my novels there have links, wide distribution. I have a couple of short stories that are free via BookFunnel. I'm going to plug my Kari Chronicles, book 1, Project Orca. About my 18-year-old genius telepath bringing down a billionaire on a converted cruise ship. There's reasons, you just have to read about it. That is out. Book 2 comes out in November, and I'll actually be reading from Orca at the 4:30 panel. So, yay, you can check it there.
Yay, great. Keila.
Okay, so I put most of my blogs on the Shameless of Promotion chat, but I have a newsletter. You can follow me there. I'm also going to be adding virtual booklets that are going to be pay what you want on my coffee. So follow my coffee for those on December. And yeah, play Signalis. I don't have much to plug right now.
Right. Absolutely second the plug to Play Signalis. Michael.
You can find me at michaelgwilliamsbooks.com. Very straightforward also. And my latest book is a queer Appalachian cosmic horror novel called Children of Solitude, about a mean queen whose horrible mother is finally dead. And when he goes to clean out her house, he discovers that it is haunted or worse. And inexplicably, his favorite porn star lives next door and is flirtatious. And thus, as a romance unfolds, because it's a horror romance, he has to ask himself what the effects were of growing up really isolated and alienated on himself as a person. And he has to confront the possibility that the place he escaped 20 years ago has simply managed to trap him again. And it's a lot of fun. It's funny. It has probably one of the funniest dialogue bits in a funeral scene that I've ever gotten to write. And it's also creepy. So it's a lot of fun. And you can also there at michaelgwilliamsbooks.com, you can find links to all the places to buy all of my books. You can sign up for my newsletter, and you can find a page that I keep updated with links to where I am on the turbulent seas of social media.
Great. And closing out the panel myself, once again, my name is Molly Topple, and you can find me at horroreditor.com. And I think that I will turn things over to Tucker, who seems ready to do the actual closing.
Yeah, this was really great. Thanks so much to all our panelists. There are so many possibilities in queer fiction, so I'm glad we got to explore some of them today, and I hope everyone who tuned in feels some new possibilities opening in their own writing, in their own reading. We got some good recommendations here. So to everyone, join the conversation in the RSM Discord and join us for our next panel, which will be writing queer stories for middle grade and young adults starting in a half hour. Thanks so much again, and see you soon.